The fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport hummed overhead as thousands of travelers rushed through the terminal on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning. But in Gate C-17, something sinister was about to unfold that would turn this routine travel day into an absolute nightmare for one innocent passenger. Our story begins with Patricia Henderson, a 53-year-old woman with perfectly styled platinum blonde hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head, and a Louis Vuitton carry-on that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Patricia wasn't just any traveler. She was a woman who had mastered the art of manipulation, who believed the rules were for everyone else, and who was about to execute the most disturbing plan anyone in that airport had ever witnessed. Patricia had been planning this for 3 weeks. 3 entire weeks of carefully orchestrating every detail, every movement, every calculated step. You see, Patricia was in the middle of a bitter divorce with her ex-husband Marcus, and Marcus's new girlfriend, 28-year-old Sarah Chen, was about to board a flight to Seattle for a job interview that could change her life. Patricia had discovered Sarah's travel plans through some aggressive social media stalking, and her twisted mind had conjured up a plan so vile, so potentially dangerous, that it would send chills down anyone's spine. She was going to plant something in Sarah's bag, not just anything. Something that would look exactly like an explosive device to TSA scanners. Patricia arrived at the airport 3 hours before Sarah's scheduled flight. She positioned herself in the crowded pre-security area, blending in perfectly with the chaos of morning travelers. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm, almost serene. She had rehearsed this moment in her bathroom mirror dozens of times. She knew exactly what she needed to do. In her oversized purse, carefully wrapped in a scarf, was a modified electronic device she had assembled from parts ordered online. It wasn't actually dangerous, but it was specifically designed to look threatening on an X-ray machine. Wires, a small circuit board, a battery pack, and a digital timer display, all configured to resemble something that would immediately trigger every alarm in the TSA screening area. Patricia's plan was simple but cruel. Plant this device in Sarah's carry-on bag when she wasn't looking, let Sarah go through security, and watch as her life imploded in front of hundreds of witnesses. Sarah arrived at the airport exactly 90 minutes before her flight, just as Patricia had predicted. She was nervous, clutching her leather messenger bag close to her chest, mentally reviewing her interview talking points. She had no idea that someone was watching her every move with the intensity of a predator stalking prey. Sarah stopped at a coffee kiosk near the security entrance, setting her bag down on a nearby chair while she ordered her usual vanilla latte. This was the moment Patricia had been waiting for. With the practiced grace of a seasoned shoplifter, Patricia moved through the crowd, her body language casual, her movements fluid and unremarkable. She positioned herself behind the chair where Sarah's bag rested, pretending to adjust her own luggage. The airport was crowded enough that nobody was paying attention to anyone else. Everyone was absorbed in their own travel stress, their own phones, their own conversations. Patricia's hand slipped into her purse, fingers wrapping around the cloth-covered device. Her pulse was thundering in her ears, but her face remained perfectly neutral. She glanced around one final time, confirming that Sarah was still engaged with the barista, her back turned. In one smooth motion, Patricia unzipped the outer pocket of Sarah's messenger bag and slid the device inside, nestling it between some folders and a makeup pouch. The entire action took less than 5 seconds. Patricia rezipped the pocket, stepped away, and moved back into the flow of foot traffic as if nothing had happened. She felt a surge of dark satisfaction wash over her. Phase 1. Complete. Sarah returned to her bag moments later, completely oblivious to what had just occurred. She took a sip of her coffee, checked her phone one more time, and then headed toward the security line. Patricia followed at a distance, maintaining several people between them, her phone held up as if she was texting but actually watching Sarah's every move. The security line was moderately long, maybe 20 people deep, snaking back and forth through the roped-off corridor. Patricia positioned herself 4 people behind Sarah, close enough to witness the impending disaster, but far enough to avoid any immediate suspicion. She could already imagine the scene. Sarah's bag would go through the scanner. Alarms would blare. TSA agents would surround her. Police would be called. And Sarah would miss her flight, miss her interview, and possibly face serious legal consequences. Patricia's lips curved into the slightest hint of a smile. But what Patricia didn't know What she couldn't have possibly anticipated was that Denver International Airport had recently upgraded its security system with some of the most advanced surveillance technology in the country. Not just the standard cameras positioned at obvious checkpoints, but hundreds of high-definition AI-enhanced cameras positioned throughout the entire terminal, designed to track suspicious behavior patterns, unusual movements, and potential security threats. And one of those cameras had captured everything. Every single moment of Patricia's approach to Sarah's bag, every second of her hand slipping inside that outer pocket, every frame of her carefully planting that device and walking away. In a security control room 3 floors below the main terminal, a TSA supervisor named Derek Martinez was monitoring the morning feeds when his attention was caught by an alert on his screen. The AI system had flagged an unusual behavioral pattern near gate C17. A woman approaching another passenger's unattended bag, making physical contact, and immediately moving away. Derek leaned forward, his trained eyes scanning the footage. He rewound the sequence, watching it again in slow motion. His stomach dropped. This wasn't a casual bump or an accidental touch. This was deliberate. This was something being placed into that bag. Derek immediately reached for his radio, his voice urgent but controlled. Security protocol was about to kick into high gear, and neither Patricia nor Sarah had any idea what was coming. Derek's message went out simultaneously to multiple security personnel throughout the terminal. The TSA screening supervisor received it. The plainclothes security officers patrolling the concourse received it. Airport police received it. Within 90 seconds, a coordinated response was being quietly orchestrated. Nobody was running. Nobody was shouting. Everything was being handled with precision and professionalism to avoid causing panic among the thousands of innocent travelers moving through the airport. But make no mistake, every available eye was now focused on Patricia Henderson and Sarah Chen, tracking their movements, preparing for intervention at exactly the right moment. Sarah placed her messenger bag and her small roller suitcase into the gray plastic bins, removed her laptop as instructed, and stepped into the body scanner. She raised her arms above her head, held her breath for a moment, and then stepped through when prompted. Everything felt routine, normal. She was already thinking about her connecting flight, about the interview, about the presentation she had prepared. But behind her, just a few positions back in line, Patricia was watching with barely contained anticipation. She watched as Sarah's bags disappeared into the X-ray machine tunnel. She waited for the moment when everything would erupt into chaos. Any second now, she thought. Any second, those TSA agents would see that device, and Sarah's world would come crashing down. The TSA agent monitoring the X-ray screen suddenly paused the conveyor belt. Sarah's bag had triggered an alert. The agent's eyes narrowed as she examined the image on her screen, her hand hovering over the communication button. Patricia's heart leaped with excitement. It was happening. Finally, it was happening. But what Patricia didn't see was the second TSA agent who had just received an urgent message through his earpiece. What she didn't notice was how that agent's eyes immediately locked onto her, studying her face, her body language, her position in line. What she completely missed was the plainclothes security officer who had just emerged from a side door and was now positioned directly behind her, his hand resting casually near his radio. Sarah was asked to step aside to a separate screening area. She complied immediately, confusion evident on her face but still cooperative. She had nothing to hide, so she wasn't particularly worried. Maybe her laptop hadn't been properly separated. Maybe there was some metallic object in her bag that needed a closer look. These things happened all the time. A TSA agent carefully removed Sarah's messenger bag from the bin and carried it to a stainless steel examination table. Sarah stood nearby, watching as the agent put on blue latex gloves and began to carefully open each compartment of her bag. The agent's movements were methodical, professional, and surprisingly gentle. She removed Sarah's laptop, her chargers, her makeup pouch, some folders containing her presentation materials, and then her hand reached into that outer pocket, the one Sarah rarely used, and pulled out something Sarah had definitely never seen before. The agent's face remained neutral, but her body language shifted subtly. She carefully placed the device on the table and immediately stepped back, speaking quietly into her radio. Within seconds, 2 more agents appeared, along with a supervisor and that same plainclothes security officer. Sarah's confusion turned to genuine alarm. What was that thing? Where did it come from? She had never seen it before in her life. Her voice came out higher than normal, shaky with panic. She tried to explain that it wasn't hers, that she had no idea how it got in her bag, but the agents weren't responding to her protests. They were professional, calm, but clearly taking this very seriously. Sarah felt tears beginning to well up in her eyes. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not when everything was finally going right in her life. Patricia, still in line, couldn't fully see what was happening at the secondary screening area, but she could see enough. She could see the cluster of officials, the serious expressions, Sarah's obvious distress. Victory surged through her chest. She had done it. She had actually done it. Marcus's little girlfriend was finished. Her career was over before it even started. Patricia allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, already imagining how she would casually mention this incident to Marcus later, feigning shock and concern while secretly relishing his devastation. But then something happened that wiped that smile completely off her face. The plainclothes security officer who had been standing behind her suddenly spoke, his voice quiet but firm, meant only for her ears. He asked her to please step out of line and come with him. Patricia's blood went cold. She turned to face him, her expression immediately shifting to one of confused innocence. There must be some mistake, she insisted. She was just trying to catch her flight. She had done nothing wrong. But the officer wasn't asking. He was instructing. And now a second security officer had appeared on her other side. Patricia's mind was racing. How could they possibly know? She had been so careful. The airport was crowded. Nobody had been watching. Nobody could have seen. She maintained her innocent facade but complied, allowing herself to be escorted out of the security line. Other passengers were staring now, whispering to each other, some pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a dramatic scene. Patricia kept her head high, still convinced this was some kind of misunderstanding that she could talk her way out of. After all, she always talked her way out of everything. She was led to a small private security office adjacent to the main screening area. The room was sterile and windowless, with a plain table, a few chairs, and a large monitor mounted on the wall. Supervisor Derek Martinez was already there, along with 2 airport police officers. Patricia was asked to sit down. She did, placing her designer purse on the table, still maintaining that confused, slightly annoyed expression that suggested she was the victim of some bureaucratic incompetence. Derek didn't waste time with pleasantries. He turned on the monitor, and Patricia found herself looking at security footage. Airport surveillance. Her heart began to pound harder, but she kept her face neutral. The footage showed the coffee kiosk area. She recognized it immediately. And then she saw herself on screen, moving through the crowd, approaching Sarah's unattended bag. Patricia's throat went dry. She watched her own recorded actions, frame by frame, as she reached into her purse, pulled out the cloth-wrapped device, unzipped Sarah's bag, placed it inside, and walked away. The footage was crystal clear, high definition, absolutely undeniable. There was no explaining this away, no talking her way out of it, no claiming it was a misunderstanding or an accident. The evidence was right there, captured in perfect detail by cameras she never even knew existed. Derek leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of professional seriousness and barely concealed disgust. He asked Patricia if she would like to explain what she had just watched herself doing. Patricia's mind was completely blank. Her carefully constructed plan, her weeks of preparation, her moment of triumph, it was all crumbling into dust. Derek played the footage again, this time with timestamps clearly visible. He pointed out how Patricia had been watching Sarah for several minutes before making her move. How she had deliberately waited for Sarah to turn her back. How she had checked her surroundings to ensure nobody was watching, completely unaware of the overhead cameras capturing her every movement. He explained that the airport's new AI-enhanced surveillance system had flagged her behavior as suspicious within seconds of the incident occurring. The system had tracked her movements, identified her face, and alerted security personnel before Sarah had even reached the security checkpoint. Patricia had been under observation the entire time, and she hadn't had the slightest clue. One of the airport police officers asked Patricia to empty her purse onto the table. She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly now, the facade of confidence finally beginning to crack. The officer repeated the instruction, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Patricia slowly opened her designer bag and began removing items. wallet, phone, makeup compact, tissue pack, sunglasses case. And then, at the bottom of the bag, wrapped in that same scarf she had used to conceal the device earlier, was a small notebook. The officer picked it up, flipped through a few pages, and his eyebrows rose. He handed the notebook to Derek, who began reading through it carefully. With each page he turned, his expression grew more serious. The notebook contained Patricia's entire plan, written in her own handwriting. Detailed notes about Sarah's social media activity, screenshots she had taken of Sarah's posts mentioning her Seattle interview, research about TSA screening procedures and what types of items would trigger alarms, sketches of the device she intended to build, a timeline of when to arrive at the airport and where to position herself, notes about how to approach Sarah's bag without being noticed. It was all there, a complete roadmap of premeditation that transformed this from a possible impulsive act into clear evidence of calculated, malicious intent. Derek looked up from the notebook, his expression now one of complete incredulity. He asked Patricia why on earth she would write all of this down. Patricia had no answer. In her arrogance and obsession, she had never considered the possibility of being caught, so she had never considered the danger of documenting her own crime. Meanwhile, back in the screening area, Sarah was being interviewed by a different TSA supervisor in a more comfortable private room. The supervisor's tone had shifted from cautious to sympathetic. They had reviewed the footage, the supervisor explained gently. They knew the device hadn't been placed in Sarah's bag by her. They knew she was a victim of what appeared to be a targeted attempt to sabotage her travel and potentially create a serious security incident. Sarah's relief was so overwhelming that she actually started crying. Not tears of fear anymore, but tears of pure emotional release. She had been seconds away from being arrested, from having her entire life turned upside down, from missing the most important job interview of her career. And now she was learning that not only was she not in trouble, but the person who had tried to destroy her was already in custody. The supervisor asked if Sarah knew anyone who might want to harm her, anyone who might have a motive to plant something in her bag. Sarah's mind immediately went to Patricia, Marcus's ex-wife, the woman who had been harassing them both for months with threatening messages, showing up at places they went, spreading vicious rumors on social media. Sarah explained the entire history to the supervisor, how Marcus and Patricia's marriage had ended 2 years ago due to Patricia's controlling behavior and emotional abuse, how Marcus had met Sarah a year later through mutual friends, how Patricia had immediately begun a campaign of harassment, creating fake social media accounts to leave cruel comments, sending threatening text messages at all hours, even showing up at Sarah's workplace once to confront her in the parking lot. Sarah had always known Patricia was vindictive, but this was on an entirely different level. This was psychotic. Sarah provided the investigators with Patricia's full name, her contact information, her relationship to Marcus, and the extensive history of harassment. She offered to forward the threatening messages and emails Patricia had sent over the past several months. Everything clicked into place immediately. Back in the security office, when confronted with Sarah's detailed statement and asked directly about her relationship to the victim, Patricia finally broke. Not with remorse or apology, but with rage. She exploded into a furious tirade about how Sarah had stolen her husband, how Marcus had never loved anyone the way he loved Patricia, how Sarah was a manipulative gold digger who deserved everything that was happening to her. She insisted she was just trying to teach Sarah a lesson, to show her that actions have consequences, to make her understand that you don't destroy families without paying a price. The officers let her talk, let her dig her own grave deeper with every venomous word that spilled from her mouth. They were recording everything, of course. Every confession, every admission, every justification would be used against her in court. Patricia seemed to realize this mid-rant, and suddenly fell silent, her face going pale as the full weight of her situation began to sink in. The airport police officer informed her that she was being detained pending federal charges. He explained that planting any device designed to look like an explosive, even if it wasn't actually functional, constituted interference with airport security operations, a federal offense. Additionally, she would likely face charges of harassment, stalking, and criminal endangerment. Each of these charges carried significant prison time. What Patricia didn't understand, even as she sat there in stunned silence, was just how serious federal crimes were compared to state offenses. Federal courts had minimum sentencing guidelines. Federal prisons had no parole. If she was convicted, she would serve at least 85% of her sentence, and possibly the entire duration. Her expensive lawyers, her social connections, her carefully cultivated image of respectability, none of that would matter in federal court. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The security footage, her own notebook documenting her premeditation, her confession on tape, and Sarah's testimony about the pattern of harassment all combined to create an absolutely ironclad case. Any defense attorney worth their fee would immediately advise her to negotiate a plea deal rather than risk going to trial. The device itself was being carefully examined by TSA explosives specialists in a secure area of the airport. They photographed it from every angle, documented each component, tested it to confirm it was non-functional. Their report would note that while the device posed no actual threat, it had been deliberately configured to appear threatening on X-ray equipment. The wiring pattern, the placement of the battery pack, the addition of the digital timer display, all of these elements suggested someone with at least basic knowledge of what explosive devices looked like on security scanners. Patricia's online purchase history would be subpoenaed, revealing her orders for electronic components, wiring, and circuit boards in the weeks leading up to the incident. Every digital breadcrumb she had left would be traced, documented, and entered into evidence. Airport police formally arrested Patricia Henderson at 11:47 that morning. She was read her Miranda rights, handcuffed with her arms behind her back, and escorted through the airport in front of hundreds of stunned travelers. Some people recognized what was happening and pulled out their phones, recording the walk of shame as this perfectly coiffed, designer-dressed woman was led away by officers. Patricia's face was no longer composed. She was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks, her voice shrill as she alternated between demanding to speak with her lawyer and screaming about how unfair everything was. The officers remained professional and silent, guiding her firmly but without unnecessary force toward the airport police station where she would be processed and formally charged. Her flight to wherever she had pretended to be going would not be boarded. In fact, Patricia wouldn't be boarding any flights for a very, very long time. Sarah, meanwhile, was cleared to continue her travel. TSA expedited her through security, apologizing profusely for the trauma she had experienced. They even arranged for her to be escorted directly to her gate by a senior TSA agent to ensure she wouldn't miss her flight, and to provide additional support given what she had been through. The airport staff couldn't have been more apologetic or accommodating. As Sarah sat in the departure lounge waiting for boarding to begin, she was still processing everything that had happened. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held her phone, trying to compose herself enough to call Marcus and explain the situation. When Marcus answered, his voice was cheerful and encouraging, wishing her luck with the interview. Sarah's voice cracked immediately, and the entire story poured out. Marcus was silent for a long moment after she finished, and then he spoke with a level of fury Sarah had never heard from him before. He was horrified by what Patricia had done, absolutely enraged that she had escalated from harassment to something that could have resulted in Sarah's arrest or worse. But he was also deeply concerned about Sarah's emotional state and well-being. He told her that he was proud of how she had handled everything, that she was incredibly strong, and that Patricia would finally face real consequences for her actions. He immediately contacted his attorney to discuss getting an emergency restraining order and exploring additional civil litigation against Patricia for emotional distress and attempted destruction of Sarah's career prospects. The story could have ended there, with Patricia arrested and Sarah continuing to her interview. But karma wasn't quite finished yet. As Patricia was being processed at the airport police station, her personal belongings were inventoried according to standard procedure. Her expensive purse, her designer luggage, her jewelry, her phone, and that damning notebook. A female officer was tasked with searching Patricia's carry-on suitcase more thoroughly. Beneath Patricia's meticulously folded designer clothes, tucked into a side compartment, the officer discovered something else. Printed screenshots of Sarah's social media posts, with dates and locations highlighted in yellow marker. Printed copies of Marcus's public Facebook photos showing him and Sarah together, with Sarah's face scribbled out in angry red ink. And perhaps most disturbing, a printed map of Sarah's apartment, complex with her specific unit circled and notes about her typical schedule. This evidence revealed that Patricia's obsession went far deeper than anyone had initially realized. This wasn't just about sabotaging one flight. This was evidence of stalking behavior, of surveillance, of an escalating pattern that could have led to physical violence if it hadn't been interrupted. The officers immediately contacted the FBI, as interstate stalking fell under federal jurisdiction. An FBI agent arrived at the airport police station within the hour to interview Patricia and collect the additional evidence. The charges against Patricia were growing more serious by the minute. What had started as interference with airport security was now expanding to include federal stalking charges, which carried their own substantial penalties. The FBI agent, a woman named Special Agent Jennifer Wu, sat across from Patricia in the interrogation room and laid out all of the evidence methodically. The device, the notebook with the detailed plan, the surveillance materials found in Patricia's luggage, the history of threatening communications that Sarah and Marcus would provide. Agent Wu explained that Patricia was looking at multiple federal charges that, combined, could result in up to 20 years in federal prison. She offered Patricia one opportunity to cooperate fully, to explain her actions, to show any semblance of remorse, and to potentially work toward a plea agreement that might result in a reduced sentence. Patricia's response was to demand her lawyer and refuse to say anything else. It was the first smart decision she had made all day, though it was far too late to save her from the consequences of her earlier choices. Patricia's bail hearing took place 2 days later in federal court. Her attorney, an expensive criminal defense lawyer named Richard Brennan who specialized in white-collar crimes, argued that his client posed no flight risk, had no prior criminal record, and should be released on her own recognizance pending trial. The federal prosecutor, however, presented a very different picture. She described Patricia as a danger to the community, citing the stalking behavior, the evidence of escalating obsession, and the fact that she had been willing to potentially endanger hundreds of airport travelers in pursuit of her vendetta against one person. The prosecutor argued that if released, Patricia would likely continue to harass and potentially harm Sarah Chen. The prosecutor requested bail be set at $500,000. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Margaret Thornton, reviewed the evidence presented. She looked at the security footage, read excerpts from Patricia's notebook, examined the stalking materials found in her luggage. Judge Thornton's expression grew increasingly severe as she reviewed each piece of evidence. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold with disgust. She agreed with the prosecution that Patricia posed a credible threat to the victim and potentially to public safety. However, she set bail at $250,000 rather than the requested $500,000, acknowledging Patricia's lack of prior criminal history. She also imposed strict conditions. If Patricia posted bail, she would be required to wear an electronic monitoring ankle bracelet, surrender her passport, have no contact whatsoever with Sarah Chen or Marcus Henderson, and remain confined to her residence except for meetings with her attorney and required court appearances. Patricia couldn't post the bail immediately. Her assets were largely tied up in the ongoing divorce proceedings with Marcus, and most of her liquid cash had been spent on legal fees for the divorce itself. She would have to contact family members or attempt to secure a bail bond, which would require collateral. For the time being, she remained in a county detention facility, housed in a single cell due to the high-profile nature of her case. Her designer clothes were replaced with an orange jumpsuit. Her perfectly manicured nails grew ragged. Her styled hair became disheveled and unwashed. For someone who had spent her entire adult life carefully cultivating an image of wealth, sophistication, and control, this was perhaps the most devastating punishment imaginable. She was nobody in jail, just another inmate, just another person who had made catastrophically bad choices and was now facing the consequences. News of the incident spread quickly through various channels. It started with airport employees who had witnessed the arrest sharing the story with colleagues. Then local news outlets picked up the story from police scanners and incident reports. Within 48 hours, major news networks were covering it. The security footage of Patricia planting the device was released to the media by the FBI as part of their public information efforts to demonstrate the effectiveness of modern airport security measures. The footage went viral on social media, shared millions of times across platforms with captions like, "Airport Karen gets instant justice," and "Watch this woman's plan backfire spectacularly." People were outraged, horrified, and morbidly fascinated by the story. How could someone be so vindictive? How could jealousy and bitterness drive a person to such dangerous extremes? How could she have been stupid enough to document her entire plan in writing? The comment sections were absolutely brutal. Patricia's full name was published in news reports, along with her photo from the arrest. Her previous social media accounts, which she had made private but never deleted, were found and archived by internet sleuths. Her posts showing off her lavish lifestyle, her expensive vacations, her sense of entitlement and superiority were screenshot and shared widely as examples of the toxic mindset that had led to her downfall. Her reputation, which she had guarded so carefully and built over decades, was completely destroyed in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, sympathy and support poured in for Sarah from all directions. Local news outlets portrayed her as the innocent victim of a deranged ex-wife's jealousy. People who had experienced similar harassment reached out to share their own stories and offer encouragement. Several news outlets requested interviews, wanting to hear Sarah's account firsthand. Sarah initially declined all interview requests. She was overwhelmed by the media attention and just wanted to move forward with her life. But her attorney advised her that telling her story publicly might actually help her civil case against Patricia and could provide closure. Eventually, Sarah agreed to one carefully controlled interview with a respected journalist, during which she described her experience with grace and composure, never attacking Patricia personally, but simply recounting the facts and expressing hope that her story might help other harassment victims feel empowered to report. Threatening behavior before it escalated, Sarah arrived in Seattle despite the morning chaos and absolutely crushed her job interview. Despite everything she had been through just hours earlier, despite the trauma and fear and emotional exhaustion, she walked into that conference room and delivered the presentation of her life. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was the sheer relief of having survived such a nightmare. Maybe it was the realization that Patricia's attempt to destroy her had actually made her stronger, more resilient, more determined than ever to succeed. Or maybe it was simply that Sarah was genuinely talented and well-prepared, and no amount of external chaos could change that fundamental truth. She answered every question with confidence. She connected with the interview panel. She demonstrated exactly why she was the right person for the position. 3 days later, Sarah received the phone call that would change her life. The company was offering her the position, a senior role in their product development division, with a salary that was 30% higher than what she was currently making. Full benefits, stock options, relocation assistance. It was everything she had hoped for and more. When she called Marcus to tell him the good news, they both cried together on the phone. Not just tears of happiness about the job, but tears of relief that Patricia's reign of terror was finally, definitively over. Patricia had tried to destroy Sarah's future, and instead, Sarah's future had never looked brighter. Marcus immediately filed for an emergency restraining order against Patricia, which was granted by the court given the circumstances and the pending criminal charges. The order prohibited Patricia from any contact with Marcus or Sarah, from coming within 500 feet of either of them, and from any form of communication, whether direct or through third parties. Marcus also provided investigators with his phone, which contained months of threatening text messages from Patricia. Messages sent at 2 a.m. telling him he would regret leaving her. Messages calling Sarah vile names and making vague threats about making her pay. Messages claiming that Marcus would never be happy without Patricia, that he was making the biggest mistake of his life, that she would make sure he suffered for his betrayal. The digital evidence kept mounting. Investigators obtained warrants for Patricia's phone and computer, revealing extensive online searches about TSA procedures, airport security vulnerabilities, and how to build devices that would trigger screening alarms. Her internet history showed she had researched similar cases of people planting items in other passengers' luggage, apparently learning from those examples. She had visited forums discussing airport security weaknesses. She had even watched YouTube videos about what items were most likely to cause secondary screening. Every search, every video view, every website visit became another nail in her legal coffin, demonstrating clear premeditation and intent. Patricia's attorney, Richard Brennan, reviewed the evidence against his client and had a very frank conversation with her during a jail visit. He explained that the case against her was essentially unbeatable. The video evidence alone was damning, but combined with her written plan, her confession on tape, the physical evidence of stalking, and her history of harassing communications, no jury would ever acquit her. Her only realistic option was to negotiate a plea deal with the prosecution that might result in a reduced sentence. Patricia initially refused, insisting she had just been trying to teach Sarah a lesson, that she never intended for anyone to actually get hurt. Brennan explained patiently that intent to cause physical harm wasn't required for the charges she was facing. Intent to disrupt airport operations, intent to cause someone to be falsely accused, and intent to harass and intimidate were more than sufficient. Patricia's intentions, no matter how she tried to frame them, were clearly malicious. The federal prosecutor's office wasn't particularly interested in being lenient with Patricia. Her case had garnered significant media attention, and there was public pressure to make an example of her to deter similar behavior. The prosecutor's initial offer was a plea agreement that would require Patricia to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 12 years in federal prison followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Brennan tried to negotiate for less time, arguing that his client had no prior criminal record and was essentially having a mental breakdown related to her divorce. The prosecutor was unmoved. She pointed out that thousands of people go through difficult divorces every year without resorting to federal crimes or attempting to destroy innocent people's lives. After several rounds of negotiation, a plea agreement was finally reached. Patricia would plead guilty to federal charges of interference with airport security operations, interstate stalking, and criminal harassment. In exchange, the prosecution would recommend a sentence of 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Patricia would also be required to pay full restitution to Sarah for any damages, including therapy costs, lost wages from the day of the incident, and any other documented expenses related to the trauma Patricia had caused. Additionally, Patricia would be required to forfeit any weapons, would be permanently prohibited from contacting Sarah or Marcus in any way, and would have to register as a stalker in any state where she eventually resided after her release. 3 months after that terrible Tuesday morning at the airport, Patricia Henderson stood in federal court for her sentencing hearing. She had finally posted bail several weeks earlier with help from her brother, so she was no longer wearing a jail jumpsuit, but the ankle monitor was visible beneath her conservative court attire. She looked like she had aged a decade in those 3 months. The stress, the public humiliation, the weight of her choices, all of it showed in her face. Her attorney delivered a prepared statement asking for leniency, describing Patricia's previously unblemished record, her mental health struggles related to the divorce, and her alleged remorse for her actions. The prosecutor then stood and delivered a powerful rebuttal, describing the premeditation, the sophistication of Patricia's plan, the potential danger she had created in a crowded airport, and the lasting trauma she had inflicted on an innocent woman who had never done anything to her beyond having the audacity to fall in love with Patricia's ex-husband. Sarah Chen also addressed the court, giving what's known as a victim impact statement. She described the terror of watching TSA agents pull an unknown device from her bag, the panic of being surrounded by security, the fear that her life was about to be destroyed by accusations of terrorism, the overwhelming relief when she learned she was being framed, immediately followed by the horror of realizing how deep Patricia's hatred ran. Sarah spoke about the nightmares she still experienced, the anxiety she now felt every time she traveled through an airport, the way she constantly looked over her shoulder, wondering if Patricia had any accomplices who might continue the harassment. She described how Patricia's actions hadn't just affected one day, but had created lasting psychological damage that she was working through with a therapist. Sarah's statement was powerful, emotional, and devastatingly effective. Judge Thornton listened to all arguments and then took a brief recess to consider the appropriate sentence. When she returned to the bench, her expression was grave. She addressed Patricia directly, stating that while the court acknowledged her lack of prior criminal history, the severity and premeditation of her actions could not be overlooked. The judge noted that Patricia had not only committed federal crimes, but had done so in a way that showed callous disregard for Sarah's well-being, for public safety, and for the law itself. Judge Thornton accepted the negotiated plea agreement and sentenced Patricia to 7 years in federal prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised probation. She emphasized that Patricia would serve this sentence in a federal facility where there was no parole, meaning she would serve at least 85% of the sentence regardless of good behavior. Additionally, Patricia was ordered to pay $50,000 in restitution to Sarah Chen for emotional damages, therapy costs, and other documented expenses. As Patricia was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she looked 20 years older than she had on that Tuesday morning at the airport. The weight of her choices, the destruction of her reputation, the loss of her freedom. All of it showed in her hunched shoulders and hollow eyes. The woman who had once carried herself with such confidence and entitlement now shuffled along between two federal marshals, heading toward a prison bus that would transport her to a federal correctional facility. Her designer clothes and carefully cultivated image were gone, replaced by the reality of what happens when bitterness and revenge consume someone completely. Patricia spent her first weeks in federal prison in a kind of shocked disbelief. The facility was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't violent or particularly dangerous, but it was soul-crushingly monotonous and dehumanizing. Every aspect of her life was controlled and scheduled. Wake-up time, meal times, work assignments, recreation periods, lights out. She had no control over anything, no ability to manipulate situations to her advantage, no status that made her special or important. She was just inmate number 47832, one of hundreds of women serving time for various federal offenses. The other inmates quickly learned her story. In prison, everyone knows everyone's business. And Patricia's case had been high-profile enough that several women recognized her immediately. The prison social hierarchy was not kind to Patricia. Inmates serving time for violent crimes, for drug offenses, even for white-collar fraud, they all looked down on her. What she had done was seen as particularly low and cowardly. Trying to frame an innocent woman for terrorism because of petty jealousy over an ex-husband? That was the kind of thing that earned contempt even from people who had committed serious crimes themselves. Patricia found herself isolated, eating alone in the cafeteria, working her assigned job in the prison laundry without any friendly interactions, spending her recreation time walking the yard by herself. The loneliness was overwhelming, but it was a loneliness entirely of her own making. As the months turned into years, Patricia had endless time to think about her choices and their consequences. She participated in required counseling sessions, where therapists tried to help her understand the twisted thinking that had led to her crimes. Slowly, painfully, Patricia began to realize just how distorted her worldview had been. She had convinced herself that Marcus belonged to her, that his happiness with someone else was a personal attack, that destroying Sarah was somehow justified. She had spent so much energy on hatred and revenge that she had destroyed her own life in the process. The therapists helped her understand that her behavior had been abusive, manipulative, and narcissistic, patterns that had apparently existed throughout her marriage and had ultimately driven Marcus away. Meanwhile, outside those prison walls, Sarah and Marcus were building the beautiful life that Patricia had tried so hard to prevent. Sarah excelled in her new position in Seattle. Within her first year, she led a product launch that exceeded all projections and earned her a promotion to senior director. She made new friends, explored the Pacific Northwest, and genuinely thrived in her new environment. Marcus eventually joined her in Seattle, relocating his consulting business and finding even more success in the new market. They bought a beautiful townhouse with a view of Puget Sound. They adopted a rescue dog named Cooper, who became their constant companion. And 18 months after the airport incident, Marcus proposed to Sarah during a weekend trip to the San Juan Islands. Their wedding took place on a perfect autumn day, surrounded by close friends and family. It was an intimate ceremony, only about 50 guests, held at a winery overlooking rolling vineyards. Sarah wore a simple but elegant dress, Marcus cried when he saw her walking down the aisle. Their vows were personal and heartfelt, referencing the challenges they had overcome together and their excitement for the future. There was no mention of Patricia during the ceremony, no acknowledgement of the darkness that had once threatened their happiness. She had become irrelevant to their story, a cautionary tale from their past rather than an active presence in their present. They danced, they laughed, they celebrated with people who genuinely loved them and wanted them to be happy. It was everything a wedding should be. Sarah and Marcus made a conscious decision not to publicize their wedding on social media. They shared a few tasteful photos with close friends and family through private channels, but nothing was posted publicly. They had learned the hard way that sharing personal information online could provide ammunition to people with bad intentions. They maintained very private social media profiles, shared minimal personal details, and lived their lives away from the public eye. This discretion wasn't driven by fear, but by wisdom. They had faced the worst that obsession and hatred could throw at them, and they had survived. Now they simply wanted peace and privacy to enjoy the life they had built together. The TSA and Denver International Airport used Patricia's case extensively in their training programs. The incident became a textbook example of how modern security systems could identify and neutralize threats that went beyond traditional terrorism or smuggling. The behavioral detection algorithms, the comprehensive surveillance network, the coordinated response from multiple security teams, all of these elements had worked together flawlessly to identify Patricia's criminal behavior and protect an innocent passenger from being falsely accused. Derek Martinez, the TSA supervisor who had first spotted Patricia's suspicious actions on the surveillance feed, received a commendation for his vigilance and quick response. The case was written up in security journals and presented at law enforcement conferences as a model of effective, multi-layered security airport. Security protocols were enhanced based on lessons learned from the incident. Additional cameras were installed in pre-security areas where passengers congregated near coffee shops and retail stores. Security personnel received additional training on identifying suspicious behavior patterns around unattended luggage. Public awareness campaigns were launched, reminding travelers to never leave their bags unattended and to immediately report anyone they observed tampering with luggage that wasn't their own. Patricia's vindictive plan, intended to destroy one person, had ended up making airport security stronger and more effective for millions of future travelers. Her actions had accomplished the exact opposite of what she intended. Inside the federal prison, Patricia's third year began much like her first and second had ended, with monotonous routine and forced introspection. She had completed various rehabilitation programs, earned her GED equivalency in computer skills to help with post-release employment prospects, and continued with mandatory therapy sessions. Her therapist reported that Patricia was finally beginning to show genuine remorse rather than just self-pity about her circumstances. She was starting to understand that her actions had been about control, that she had viewed Marcus as her possession rather than as an autonomous human being deserving of happiness. She was beginning to acknowledge that Sarah had never been the enemy, that Sarah had simply fallen in love with someone who was already divorced and available. The anger that had consumed Patricia for so long was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a deep sadness about the life she had wasted. Patricia's adult children, a son and daughter from her marriage to Marcus, had initially cut off all contact with her after her arrest. They had been horrified and humiliated by what their mother had done. Her daughter had written her a letter explaining that she couldn't have someone so toxic and unstable in her life or around her own young children. Her son had simply blocked all communication without explanation. The rejection from her children was perhaps the most painful consequence of all for Patricia, even more than the loss of freedom. After 2 years of silence, her daughter finally agreed to a supervised visit at the prison. The meeting was awkward and painful. Patricia apologized tearfully, trying to explain the mental state she had been in, though she knew there was no real explanation or excuse. Her daughter listened quietly and then explained that she wasn't ready to forgive or rebuild a relationship, but that she wanted Patricia to know her grandchildren existed and were healthy. It was a small moment of connection in years of isolation, and Patricia treasured it even though it came with the clear message that trust and family bonds, once broken, might never fully heal. As Patricia's release date eventually approached after serving 6 years of her 7-year sentence with credit for good behavior, she faced the daunting reality of re-entry into society. She would be released into a world where her story was still available with a simple internet search. Future employers would find news articles and viral videos about her crimes. Landlords would see her criminal record. She would have to register her address with authorities due to the stalking conviction. She would be on supervised probation for 3 years with regular check-ins, drug testing, and restrictions on her movements and activities. The life she had known before, the social status, the financial comfort, the respect and admiration she had cultivated, none of that would be waiting for her on the outside. Patricia was released on a gray Tuesday morning, walking out of the federal facility with nothing but a small bag of personal items and the clothes she had worn to her sentencing years earlier. Her brother picked her up, having reluctantly agreed to let her stay in his guest room while she tried to rebuild her life. The drive from the prison was quiet and uncomfortable. Her brother made it clear that his help came with strict conditions. She would follow all the rules of her probation. She would get a job, any job, and contribute to household expenses. She would attend continued therapy. She would make no attempts to contact Marcus, Sarah, or anyone connected to them. Any violation of these conditions and she would be on her own. Patricia agreed to everything. She had no other options. Adjusting to life after prison was incredibly difficult. Patricia found work eventually at a call center, a job that paid just above minimum wage and required no public interaction or background check beyond the criminal record disclosure she was legally required to provide. Her coworkers mostly ignored her. She lived quietly, working her shifts, attending her probation appointments, seeing her therapist weekly, and spending her evenings alone in her brother's guest room. Her social media accounts had been deactivated years ago during the trial. She had no desire to rejoin those platforms anyway. She knew what would be waiting for her there: the old news articles, the comments from strangers calling her every name imaginable, the permanent digital record of the worst thing she had ever done. Years after her release, Patricia still thought about that morning in the airport, not with justification or excuses anymore, but with genuine regret and horror at who she had become. She thought about Sarah, who she had never actually known beyond stalking her social media, and felt deep shame about the trauma she had inflicted on a complete stranger whose only crime had been falling in love. She thought about Marcus and realized that she had never actually loved him in a healthy way. She had loved the status he provided, the life they had built, the image of perfection they projected. But she had never truly respected him as a person or supported his authentic happiness. Her love had been selfish and possessive, and when he left to find real happiness with someone else, she had revealed her true nature. Sarah and Marcus, now married for several years, occasionally thought about Patricia too, though less and less as time went on. They had used their experience to become advocates for victims of harassment and stalking. Sarah volunteered with organizations that helped people obtain restraining orders and navigate the legal system when dealing with threatening ex-partners or obsessive individuals. She spoke at community events, sharing her story to help others understand that escalating harassment should be taken seriously and reported to authorities before it reached dangerous levels. Marcus used his consulting business platform to promote workplace safety programs focused on recognizing and responding to threatening behavior from terminated employees or estranged spouses. They had transformed their trauma into purpose, helping others avoid or survive similar situations. The story of Patricia Henderson and the airport incident became one of those cautionary tales that people share when discussing the dangers of social media oversharing, the importance of moving on from failed relationships, and the serious consequences of letting bitterness and revenge control your actions. True crime podcasts covered it. Psychology blogs analyzed Patricia's motivations and mental state. Legal experts used it as an example when teaching about federal criminal law and sentencing. The viral security footage was viewed millions of times, often accompanied by comments expressing disbelief that anyone could be so vindictive and so foolish. Patricia's name became synonymous with a certain type of entitled, destructive behavior, forever preserved in the digital amber of internet infamy. The most important lesson from this entire story isn't really about airport security or surveillance technology, though those played crucial roles in the outcome. The real lesson is about the destructive power of refusing to let go and move forward. Patricia had every opportunity to accept her divorce, process her emotions in healthy ways, and build a new life for herself. She was attractive, intelligent, financially comfortable, and had decades of life ahead of her. She could have traveled, pursued hobbies, made new friends, even found love again with someone better suited to her. Instead, she chose to fixate on Marcus and Sarah, to nurture her resentment until it poisoned everything in her life, and to plan an elaborate revenge that accomplished nothing except destroying her own future. Every step of the way, she had choices, and every choice she made led her further down a path that ended in a federal prison cell. Sarah and Marcus's story, by contrast, is about resilience and choosing happiness despite opposition. They could have let Patricia's harassment drive them apart. They could have given up on their relationship to avoid the drama and danger. They could have lived in fear even after Patricia was incarcerated. Instead, they chose to support each other, to build their life together deliberately and joyfully, and to use their experience to help others. They chose love over fear, growth over stagnation, and purpose over victimhood. Their wedding wasn't just a celebration of their commitment to each other, but a declaration that Patricia's hatred had failed to break them. They won not by destroying their enemy, but by refusing to let their enemy destroy them. As this story finally comes to its close, think about the choices you make when facing difficult emotions like jealousy, anger, or loss. Think about whether you're holding on to resentments that are hurting you more than anyone else. Think about whether your desire for revenge or validation is worth the potential consequences to your freedom, your relationships, your future. Patricia Henderson spent 3 weeks planning her revenge and will spend the rest of her life dealing with the consequences of those few seconds in an airport when she chose to plant a device in a stranger's bag. Those few seconds cost her 7 years of freedom, her relationship with her children, her reputation, her career, and any chance at a peaceful, happy future. Was it worth it? She would tell you now that it absolutely was not. So the next time you're tempted to retaliate against someone who hurt you, or to sabotage someone who has something you want, or to indulge in elaborate revenge fantasies, remember Patricia. Remember that modern world has cameras everywhere capturing everything. Remember that premeditation makes everything worse from a legal standpoint. Remember that federal crimes carry federal consequences. Remember that the satisfaction of revenge is temporary, but the consequences are permanent. And most importantly, remember that the best way to deal with people who try to bring you down is to live well despite them, to find your own happiness and success, and to let karma handle the rest. Because as Patricia learned the hardest way possible, karma doesn't need your help. It just needs time and the inevitable consequences that follow destructive choices. Patricia's story serves as a final warning about the price of obsession and the futility of revenge. Sarah and Marcus's story serves as inspiration about the power of resilience and choosing love over hate. And somewhere in between these two narratives is a lesson we all need to hear. Your life is too precious, your future is too important, and your freedom is too valuable to waste on hatred of people who have moved on. Let go, move forward, build something beautiful with your life, instead of destroying it in a futile attempt to destroy someone else's. Because in the end, the only person you truly destroy with revenge is yourself. Patricia learned this lesson at the cost of everything she had. Don't make the same mistake.